start this discussion with a paradox. I would say that Wavelength is probably the single most important film in the development of me as a filmmaker. And yet, when I was putting together this list of films that I wanted to talk about, I almost forgot to include it. And I'll go a little further and say that it's probably the one film on this list that is almost guaranteed to be unknown to most people unless they've had a film or art school education. So if it's that important, why should it be that so few people have seen it or heard of it? And I would say the most obvious answer is that it's an experimental film. It's one of the few experimental films that has anything close to wide acceptance. And it's relatively short. It's under an hour. And it probably is not something you would think of to include because it is not a narrative feature. It is a narrative, but it's not a narrative feature. So why should this be? Well, I think it's because of the persistent prejudice in favor of narrative features. And I include my own thinking in this. When I thought of what films have most influenced me, of course, I sit down and start talking about narrative features. But Wavelength does have a narrative. It's not exactly a story, but it definitely does have a narrative in the sense of a sequence of events that move along. So I think that that in itself is important. And it points to one of the reasons why it does have semi-acceptance, at least with some audiences, is that it bridges the difference between the American experimental cinema tradition and Hollywood, which is to say that if you go to Hollywood films because you enjoy a story, well, there's enough going on in Wavelength to satisfy that, at least at a very minimal level. Okay, so having gone through all that, let me just describe the film. And by the way, it is available at YouTube if you are really interested by this and want to find out more about it. It is available to watch. It's about 43 minutes long, and it consists of the illusion of a single shot. It takes place in an empty loft apartment in New York City. And all the film is a movement from one side of the room to the other. Having said that, though, it is deceptive for a number of reasons. First of all, there are cuts in the film, even though it is often mistakenly described as being a single shot. It is not a single shot. There are both dissolves and superimpositions that if you're watching carefully, you will see. Second of all, there is a little bit of a story because as the camera crawls across the room, you do see the field of view narrowing, and someone walks into the frame and has a conversation on the phone. There's a little bit a sort of mystery element because there's a body discovered on the floor, and that is more or less just abandoned. Because the camera isn't interested in that, it's interested only in the movement forward. As you get closer and closer to the opposite wall, your eye and your mind start to ask, where is this going? Well, where it is going is to a black and white photograph on the other wall of a wave. So a pun on the title, but also because the camera eventually moves into a point where the photograph fills the frame, the space has moved from being an empty loft in New York City into the open expanse of the ocean. And so the film is basically about space and cinematic articulation of space. And that's what makes it important. That's what makes it different. But it's also what really makes it important in the history of experimental film, both because of the incorporation of this narrative element and because it relies less on editing or visual experimentation as such than in pure spatial exploration. Now, there's an American critic by the name of P. Adam Sitney who refers to this tradition as the quote-unquote structural film. I've always objected to that title, but it's current enough that if you ever hear it, that's what they're referring to. And the idea is not so much that it's a single shot, though often structural films are just single shots. It's rather the idea that it's no longer about a narrative as such. It is about the passage of time. Here, you are literally immersed in the moment, not just of the camera in the New York apartment, but of course your moment as you are watching, that you are put in this position of asking, why am I looking at this? What is going on? You become aware of your position as a spectator in the space wherever you're seeing it, which is one reason why I think watching it online is a little bit it kind of subverts the whole idea because you're so easily distracted when watching something online or on home video. So it's not quite the same thing as seeing it in a theater or an auditorium where you can't get up and leave, at least you shouldn't. So there's that aspect of it. So in effect, this is an image of time passing. So I will close with the question of, okay, so why is this so important for me personally? And I think that it's because what you get in Wavelength is a visual determinism. That's to say, forcing the viewer to look at something in a way that they normally would not. And without necessarily being aware that I was under the influence of Wavelength, though I had seen it at that point, I will refer to the last or penultimate shot in my short Super 8 film called The Tourist. Some of you have seen it. Those of you who have seen it know that I consider it to be the film in which I found my style. And at that level, because it is so heavily influenced by the kind of spatial and temporal articulation that Wavelength made possible, that's why I say it is the single most important film for me, because it provided an example that I could develop for myself. So I'll include that shot at the end of this video just so you can see the kind of thing I'm talking about. So on that note, Michael Snow's Wavelength.